I think one of the sort of interesting developments that you talk about at length in your book is the idea of how this reverberates even outside the PRC. That the sort of other Tibetans in this equation also include Tibetans in the community in exile, part of this community that you call global 𝗘𝗃𝗀𝘀, right? And I was wondering if you could explain a little bit of what you mean by that term, and sort of who's a part of this arrangement and how it contributes to the sort of marginalization of Manegacha speakers or the sort of notion that they're not part of a Tibetan linguistic community.
Yeah, sure. So global Tibeto-funny, it's kind of like on one level, it's just a descriptive term which aims to just put a label on all the people around the world who speak Tibetan. But on the other hand, it also refers to like a more normative project where people are trying to bring together all the Tibetan speakers and then bring together some other people who should be speaking Tibetan within this nationalist framework, right? So it's an effort to create a community around the Tibetan language. And there's kind of like a large dispersed infrastructure to this project stretched around the world. So at the center of it, I would say, is the Tibetan government in exile in India. So, the Dalai Lama and senior officials in the government and many other Tibetans fled in 1959 after an uprising in Lhasa. There was like an ongoing uh, process of people fleeing into exile for decades afterwards, which didn't really, which wasn't really halted until after the 2008 uprisings, and the border was really sealed after that. But so, you have decades of Tibetans leaving China, setting up in exile. They have a governing structure there. Um, some of the writing about the Tibetan government in exile talks about it having a high degree of stateness. It's a really well organized, sustained effort. They have deliberate policies around language and education for Tibetans in exile all around the world. They have they have embassies, sort of embassies and outreach offices in different countries around the world. So you have the Tibetan government in exile, and their language policy is the same as the Chinese government's language policy at its root, which is all Tibetans have one language. That language is Tibetan. So even though in the diaspora there are Manegacha speakers in the diaspora, right? But the Tibetan government in exile only promotes a single Tibetan language to them and to all other Tibetans around the world. In addition to the government in an exile, you have like a vast network of NGOs, some of which are formally aligned with the Tibetan government in exile, some of which are not. The thing that I found really challenging to think through is that, a lot of the relationships between these NGOs that focus on Tibet, like there's competition and animosity amongst them. They don't agree on tactics and strategies and end goals. So, for example, you have Tibetan organizations which promote um, complete independence from China, and you have others which promote greater autonomy within China. And there's a lot of animosity and conflict between those different NGOs. And yet, despite the fact that they don't see eye to eye on things, they all agree on this what seems like a simple fact of all Tibetans having a single Tibetan language. In much the same way that the Tibetan exile government and the Chinese state don't see eye to eye on a great many things, but they do agree on this one simple idea that all Tibetans have a single language and that language is Tibetan. So it's interesting to try and analyze these kind of complex political relationships where you have like uh, enemies in alliance over particular issues. So Tibetan government in exile, networks of NGOs. Um, you also have like NGOs like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. They're recruited into these projects as well. Human Rights Watch, in particular, has written several reports about education and language issues in Tibet. And then you also have governments like state governments, like the US government has a legal obligation to provide financial support for the Tibetan cause. There's a US Tibet Policy Act, which was just revised this year. There's a new version of it that just was has just been passed, and that commits the US government to providing a certain level of funding, to taking stances on particular issues. It creates a particular office that exists to promote Tibetan issues within the US and on global stages and so on. And so like the Tibetan cause has for many decades become this like uh, really complex network of actors all around the world with different strategies, different ideas, but all pushing this same idea that Tibetans only have a single language. So even though none of these people are the origin of the assimilatory pressures on Manegacha speakers and others, they also don't do anything to confront that assimilatory pressure that comes from the state.